This week, we're talking quarterly trade data, restaurant performance index, and a down week for cattle. Welcome to the Weekly Livestock Market update on Brownfield. I'm your host, Meghan Grebner. With us, as always, to talk all things markets, University of Missouri, Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Meghan.
We'll dig into the details of this week's reports coming up. But first, let's recap what happened this week in the markets. And I will say, while we may want to continually think we can go higher and higher and higher, at some point, it appears we have to take a breath.
It doesn't take much poor news to make record prices no longer be records. And that I think is certainly a little bit of what we've seen this week. If we start on the cattle side, live fed cattle this week were down $2.70. Those feeder cattle markets were generally steady this week, Meghan. And Monday we didn't have many of them open that would have traditionally had a sale on Monday. On the futures side, the June live cattle futures contract was down $2.35, and we lost $4 and a nickel on the August feeder cattle contract. We did see choice box beef prices move higher. They were up $1.60 this week. Briskets and ribs were both really leading the way in terms of stronger components on that choice box beef price. Hogs, really fairly flat. Cash barrels and gilts were 20 cents higher this week than where they were last week. The June lean hog futures contract was down 5 cents. We did gain $2.50 on the pork cutout value. Both hams and bellies were higher this week.
It really seemed like there wasn't a lot of trade volume. I know there was a lot of sale barns that were dark this week as well. When you take a look at that, is it less concerning knowing, one, light trade volume, two, a short week? I know there was the issue, China's blocked imports from the JBS facility in Greeley temporarily. It just kind of a whole bunch of stuff that didn't make it for an exciting week for market.
Yeah, so I think that's a lot of it. Again, we didn't do anything on Monday, and I think that's a little bit this week, maybe even the market trying to catch its breath, deciding where it wants to go. And so I'm curious what happens next week. But again, I'll say we're still talking about some pretty high cattle prices generally. So we want to keep in perspective, although it's lower, we're still talking about some fairly high prices.
All right, let's take a look at weekly slaughter. And when I say this, keep in mind, a short week. So we're going to be down a lot in comparison to the previous week.
Yeah, that's right. If we start on cattle for the week ending June 1, USDA tells us a run of 540,000 head of cattle this week. That's down 67,000 from what we did last week, down 28,000 from what we did a year ago. And on the hog side this week, a run of 2.155 million head. That's down 207,000 relative to a week ago, but up 130,000 from where we were a year ago. Just reminding us that that Memorial Day week caught us relative to last year as well here.
All right. So then let's talk about what we're seeing in terms of year-to-date cattle and hog slaughter.
Yes, we're down 4.5% on cattle slaughter year-to-date. That's been fairly consistent now the last few weeks, and we're up 0.7% on hog slaughter for the year.
I think it's worth noting, too, when we talk about, and we do this when we talk about the livestock slaughter report that comes out, but talking about the impact while we are down in terms of numbers, our production has not fallen off significantly, and a lot of that's due to higher carcass weights.
That's right. It's really kind of muted some of the effects when you realize what were 30 pound heavier weights. Typical for where we are in the cattle cycle, by the way. It's just another way to generate more beef from a smaller supply of animals.
Quarterly trade data out this week as we take a look at FY or fiscal year 2024. Let's talk a little bit about expectations for exports and how it relates to the February outlook?
Yeah, so we are looking at a quarterly update from USDA that they made no changes in terms of the overall value of trade out of the United States. So exports at 170.5 billion in the May report relative to what they were saying in February. So not a big change over that quarter. However, that FY24 number is $8.2 billion below where we were in 2023.
When you take a closer look at that, what are some things that are coming into play?
Well, I think if we just look particularly at livestock for a second, we are seeing some strength in beef export value. So you and I talk a lot about quantity down, but we're certainly talking about larger values, even though we have volume down. And so overall, when you think about the export value for the beef side, it's actually getting pulled higher. USDA actually increased that by $200 million. Dairy's been one of the bright spots, up $300 million on what was some additional cheese going into Southeast Asia relative to what USDA would have said in the earlier quarter. So there were some moves around. And again, overall, livestock, poultry, dairy, export value, USDA increased that $800 million for FY24.
We talk about exports, but there is a balance component to trade. That also means there's an import side of things. As you take a look at what those figures are, let's take a closer look at what's going on potentially this year for imports.
Yeah, so I think if we take the broad picture view for just a minute, USDA increased the value of imports by 1.5 billion in their May outlook relative to February. So $202.5 billion of imports. A lot of that horticultural products were responsible for that increase. Livestock, again, came in a little bit here. If you look at the net trade, and I think that was the big story that we saw a lot this week, was what was a net import position of $32 billion. So we're a net importer on a value basis, according to this FY24 outlook. That's the second year in a row after what was a FY22 net exporter of 1.9 billion. So top level numbers. When we look at the livestock side in particular, they did increase those import values, $600 million. Dairy imports up $400 million. That was especially cheeses from the European Union generally. Pork imports were up $200 million. But we saw also then beef imports up $100 million. That was very much up on more higher volumes than values when you look at the beef side.
I think it's worth noting, and we talk about this a lot, especially when we talk about us importing beef. We're not importing high quality prime beef. We're not taking away that market from our producers. When we talk about beef imports, it's to meet the needs of what?
Yeah, for the excess fat. When we're adding that slaughter weight on fed cattle, we're producing more fat. So that lean beef is really what we're trying to bring into the United States. You have to look no further than what cow values have done of late to remind us that lean beef's worth a lot of money, and we're looking for lean beef to mix into that ground beef product that we're putting out there.
So I just came out of a session talking about the value comparison to 50% fat, which is running about $80 a hundredweight. And when we're talking about 90% lean beef, closer to $300 a hundredweight in terms of value. When we think about that economically, obviously there's opportunity there, but we have to think about I'm assuming we have to think about the consumer side of things as well.
Absolutely. We certainly know we talk a lot about what kind of beef prices are consumers seeing at the end of the day. And ground beef has been one of those that's frankly been moving up higher as we've gone through 2024. Had we not imported some lean beef, perhaps those prices would be even higher, and we would run the risk of more switching away from ground beef to other products by consumers.
And I'm not lying when we say, or we're not lying when we say consumers love their hamburgers. 50% of beef consumption is ground beef in the United States, and that definitely plays a factor, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. We sometimes get fixated on different pieces of the beef market, and I think this is us being too general when we talk about beef as beef, but there's different markets here, and that ground beef market is certainly important to the overall value of cattle in this country.
All right. Speaking of consumers, let's talk a little restaurant performance index. As you take a look at those April numbers, what are you seeing and where are you most concerned?
Yeah, so we didn't get great news, not terrible news either. I want to be a little careful about what I say here. The April restaurant performance index, overall index, fell 0.4% relative to March. That's now several months here, 4 or 5 months, where we've been below 100, which means contraction trying to happen. Current situation index was down slightly, 0.1%. Customer traffic had a lot to do with that. Customer traffic was down about 0.5% in those numbers. Interestingly enough, well, labor also seemed to be more of an issue again this month. It was down almost 0.5% as well in that current situation index. But then expectations. So we look back at the March numbers. We actually had an expectation index slightly over 100. Now we fell back a little, about 0.6% to where we're talking about contraction. I think a lot of that is just associated with what a lot of these operators see as weakening business conditions as they look forward to the next 6 months.
All right. That is it for us. It's short, sweet, to the point this week. As you look ahead to next week, we have jobs report, we have monthly trade data. What are you looking for specifically in that monthly trade data?
Again, I think two things. One on the beef side of just, are we continuing to see enough product move out of the United States at these higher prices to maintain some demand there? Are we going to keep growing pork exports? I expect that pork export number to be higher when we get it next month. But to me, those are the two big issues out of that report.
Scott, we will check in with you next Friday.
Sounds good, Megan.
To have our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday morning, go to brownfieldagnews.com. You can also submit questions and comments. And for our daily rundown of what's going on in the commodity markets, make sure to check out John Perkins' Market Minute. Have a great weekend. I'm Meghan Grebner for Brownfield.